Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. The NARM Training Institute is offering a Level 2 NARM therapist training online so that you can attend from anywhere. The trauma field is evolving so quickly. Trauma-informed therapists who want to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder want to be trained in NARM. This online NARM therapist training is starting in April 2021 and July 2021, and they're filling up fast. So if you're interested, we'd encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. Today, we have the special pleasure of having Brad Kammer be our host. And before we get into the meat of the interview today, let me tell you about our guest. Adam Tanous is a therapist and facilitator who accompanies people through self-conscious processes using focusing, meditation, mindfulness, and breath work. In addition to guiding workshops and lectures on the subject, Adam has 13 years of experience providing therapy. He's learned many modalities, including rebirthing, focusing, shiatsu, energy therapy, and of course, NARM. His individual and group sessions are given either online or in person in English, Arabic, or Hebrew. So please welcome today's guest, Adam Tanous.
All right. Well, welcome, Adam. Nice to have you on here and really excited to dive in together, get to know you a little bit more. So maybe a place to start is just to introduce yourself for listeners.
Well, I live currently in Haifa in Israel. My work is to help people come back to their natural self, which means to be calm, to be connected through the heart, to a good health. And I do that with the help of private sessions as well as in group sessions, using focusing, talk therapy, breath work. And also I started applying NARM, even though I'm just in the middle of my online basic training.
Yeah, great. Well, we're going to talk a lot more about that because I'm curious about how you found NARM and how NARM's been supporting your work. But the place we like to start with our podcast here is, what would you hope listeners get out of our conversation today? What would you like for listeners to get?
Well, what I would like the listeners to get is like that. People have all these symptoms like anxiety, sleep disorders, relationship issues, and they don't know like what is the root cause of that. Try all these methods. Like first they try with medicine, then we try with alternative medicine, then we try with the normal psychology, and nothing really helps much until you really touch the root cause, which is developmental trauma. And you need to touch it in the correct way. It's not enough to touch it, but to touch it in the correct way. So that people would start like understanding that the root cause of these symptoms are some deep ingrained pattern from childhood. And after you get over the symptoms, there is a lot of chance for personal growth in this process of working with the developmental trauma. So it's not just about solving the symptoms, but also about personal growth afterwards. So this is what I would like the listeners to get from this.
And a great fit for you being part of our NARM community, because that's our orientation too. One of the things I was so inspired about our conversation, just getting to know you a little bit, because I have interest in the work of Israel and Palestine. And so for listeners to know that you live in Israel, but you're actually Palestinian.
You can say half-Palestinian, half Polish. My mother is Polish and my father is Palestinian.
And one of the things I was really inspired by our conversation the other day is about how you're bringing this work into some of the Palestinian communities that you're associated with. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that work and how that's been going for you.
Well, I do that to the Palestinian community here inside Israel. The Palestinian community inside Israel is about 1 million out of 8 million people here in Israel. It's very challenging. I'm doing a lot of educational stuff like lectures, now online because of the pandemic. So it's a very big educational phase now because there's a lot of resistance to do this kind of work. So it's challenging, but I'm enjoying it.
Could you tell us some of the resistances that you're facing?
Well, there are like trust issues, stuff with boundaries. So like people are afraid to go over their boundaries or that their boundaries will be entered. This is a main thing here in Israel, the boundary thing and the trust thing. So people don't allow themselves to be vulnerable. And then they say, no, for what I need self-work or inner work. So they don't allow themselves to go in, and they don't trust new things.
Okay, so now that's making much more sense about why there's such a difficulty, because it sounds like the work that you do is so much based on inner process and being vulnerable, being open, being curious.
Yeah, exactly. Connecting to the heart.
Which is probably feeling unsafe for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I asked you this before we started this podcast, but I'm just really curious if you'd share a little bit more about how you actually got into the field of working with developmental trauma, and then specifically how you found NARM.
From my personal spiritual therapeutic journey, I had chronic fatigue syndrome. I was working in the high-tech industry in computer engineering, and I had this chronic fatigue, and I started to try, to solve it. I started with the normal medicine. It didn't help at all. Then I did all kind of alternative medicine like acupuncture, shiatsu. It helped a bit. Then I tried the mainstream psychology, CBT, and 3 different psychologists for different times. And until I did, I don't know if you know, Hakomi psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Combined with focusing, which works with developmental trauma in a similar way to NARM. And there happened the big change. And my energy came back. And I discovered the patterns that I had from childhood that were keeping my energy low, and the release of the emotions. And there the big change happened. From my own personal journey, I got to work with complex trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And how I reached NARM is that I found it like very, very well organized in working with complex trauma. And I really loved it. I really loved about this. And what I loved about NARM also, that you work with curiosity and you work in the present moment, which was just affirming the work I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. So you were kind of going through your own health journey, and you were still working in a different field, and then things started to shift in the work you were doing, specifically on developmental trauma. And then is that what kind of launched you into this career path?
Yeah, and I was going and trying some kind of therapy and then studying it. And this way I became like it was 13 years ago, I started giving therapy sessions to people, and I changed my path.
So the high-tech days are behind you at this point.
Yeah, 13 years ago, that's it.
Yeah, and you told me about how many different kind of trainings you've been a part of. Like, you just stumbled across NARM because you were part of an online conference in the last year or so, right?
Yeah.
And so what do you feel like NARM has brought that might be different than some of the other approaches you've been studying up to this point?
How well it's organized, like to work with the developmental complex trauma. We have the 4 pillars, and I really loved the work with curiosity and the work in the present moment. And because in the other modalities, it's not organized like this. It's like you don't have guidelines how to go, and then you feel sometimes in the therapy sessions that it's missing. And here, when you have it like that in NARM, it helps you. Like, what I really loved about, like, in the training, when you were talking about that you learn the steps, but inside the session or inside the workshop, for me, I'm just dancing with the steps I learned, or with the skills I learned. And this is what makes the work really beautiful and a change and transformative for people.
Yeah, so that might sound paradoxical, but they actually support each other, because the structure supports the freedom to improvise or to dance.
Yeah, exactly.
And you said that you just literally heard Larry talking in some online conference you were a part of.
Yeah, it was the embodiment conference, like the biggest embodiment conference around the world. Like 500,000 people were in this online event. And even before that, at the beginning of the year, I heard them at one conference. I don't remember the name of the conference anymore. I loved it. I loved the way he spoke about it. And I found the training, and I started it.
Mm-hmm. So this is the point in the podcast we kind of get into more of the conceptual area, but I'm curious how you define complex trauma, because you use the concept of developmental trauma or complex trauma. Like, what do you think about when you're doing the presentations to your local communities? What are you sharing in terms of their understanding of complex trauma?
For me, complex trauma is what happened or didn't happen to us as children. What happened are like the ACEs, or even milder stuff, like a child that was criticized all the time. What didn't happen, like to see the child as he is, to get to know his inner world, or care for him like a good care. And because of either of these, like what happened or didn't happen, the child develops survival patterns that can cause him problems all his lifetime if he doesn't address them in the correct way. So this is for me complex trauma.
And in some ways, you talked about that from your own experience about how you were trying all these different ways to address the symptoms, but not really getting to the root cause of what these disrupted developmental patterns might be.
What is more funny about it, treating the symptoms, you use the patterns that are in your way of getting free. And, like I was a very perfectionist. So I was like very perfectionist in treating the symptoms. And these patterns, it's unbelievable how they can go even into trying to solve what you have.
Yeah, in my trainings, I always say to therapists that clients do therapy how they do everything else in their life. So how they're showing up as clients is the patterns that are getting them into therapy in the first place. And like you say, it just causes even more difficulty because really those are the patterns that are in the way of them connecting deeper. So it sounds like you had that firsthand experience. I've had that firsthand experience, and now we see it with the clients we work with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you know, I'm really curious about Israel-Palestine issues. And so so much of what we hear, at least outside of Israel-Palestine, is about all this ongoing trauma. And, you've lived there for most of your life. So from someone that has trauma training and that lives in Israel, but is half Palestinian, what's your sense of the trauma that is happening on both sides for Palestinians, whether they're living in Israel, living in the occupied territories, or Israelis? How can trauma help us understand some of what you're seeing or what might be stuck there?
It's a complicated question, because it involves so much. It involves intergenerational trauma from both sides. It involves all kinds of survival patterns that are deeply ingrained in both sides. And the work we do, like when we transform these survival patterns, just then true connection can happen between the people. And I believe if every person will take the decision to make such inner work, this is the only thing that can bring peace here to the area. It's not going to come from the leaders, because the leaders, they have their own agenda and their own. So it has to come from the people to make the change, the transformative work inside, from all the conditioning they got from their parents, from their grandparents, so that they can allow really connection to happen and peace to happen.
Yeah, so this poses a challenge, though, because you said there's resistance. So if the change has to happen from individuals, which I totally agree with, but there's resistance from individuals, what do we do there? What do you do there?
I'm doing my best. I'm trying my best to bring this to the people.
You talked about how, you notice because a lot of the trainings you're part of, you might be the only Palestinian in a room full of Israelis. And so there's some sort of disparity then between kind of what you're seeing in the Israeli communities and the Palestinian communities in terms of their openness or their engagement with psychological or personal growth work?
Yes, there is. For now, in the Israeli community, it's more spread. In the Palestinian community inside Israel, it's still less spread. And this is what I'm trying to bring more. I think it's just a matter of time.
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, maybe it's just that the Palestinian communities have been a little bit further behind.
Yeah, because they have more survival issues that they have to take care of.
Yeah, the security feels different.
Yeah, the security first, like financial wise, and then other.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about this if you're comfortable sharing more about it, but what's it like for you to be part of all these Israeli trainings and personal growth processes, and sometimes might be the only Palestinian male?
For me, it's totally okay. I don't feel any difference. For me, it's like I'm a human being meeting a human being. So I don't go to this corner, because if you choose to go there and to feel like you are Palestinian and you are different, that will make the change. Again, I believe it's how you see yourself, how you feel yourself. The environment will respond to that. And if I went there, like the only Palestinian inside of Israeli group, and I felt that I'm different, then they will respond to that I'm different. But if I go there and I'm like connecting with them like normal, like a human being, they will respond in the same way.
Yeah.
So this is again a lot of time what is in the way of the connection. So if both sides can work on making this identification less so hard and strong, this is what would make the connection much easier.
Yeah. And again, this is so aligned with NARM. I mean, now we're talking a little bit more cultural identifications, but each individual has their own identifications, and those identities are not only disconnecting them from other people, but also from themselves. And that takes us back to the beginning. You talked about your work being about helping individuals reconnect to their natural self. And I imagine that natural self, you'll have to help me understand how you define it, but it sounds like that might be free of, or at least increasingly free of, these identifications.
Well, for me, your natural self is to be first calm, like not to be overoccupied in the mind at the beginning. The second thing is to be less and less with identifications about yourself or beliefs you have about yourself. The less you have, this is the natural self. Like, if we are speaking about spiritually here, the self with the big S. So you are like free of these identifications more and more. This is your natural self. And the third is connecting through the heart. This is your natural self. And once you work on that, also to come back to physical health, that is also our natural self.
And I love how interconnected those all are.
The one affects the other, and the other affects the first.
Yeah. Are those four perspectives something that you came up with, or is that something that you've integrated from other teachings? Or
I integrated that from all the teachings I had, and from the meditation center I lived as well. I lived in a meditation center in Brazil for almost 6 months, and then a meditation center in Greece and here in Israel, and from all the studies and from all the spiritual books I read, and from all the teachings I combined that. This is what I believe in, and I want to spread.
Yeah. So some of your background is also in meditation and spiritual learning.
Yeah, meditation and mindfulness as well.
Were there any specific approaches that you took either in meditation, mindfulness, or spirituality? Or?
Well, I learned a lot of meditation methods, and I apply it. It depends on the workshop I'm giving or on the specific tool I want to give to the specific case. So because there are a lot of modalities, meditation is a very, very big word. For example, I give workshops for companies, organizations that want to have tools to work with stress effectively, and then there is a lot of mindfulness involved there. People that are, they are go more for the spiritual things, so we learn normal meditation like Vipassana meditation. There are a lot of modalities, and it's according to the workshop I'm giving or to the case.
Yeah. In the United States, historically, but even still now, psychology and spirituality have been pretty separate. Yeah. And in mainstream psychology, there's kind of like I don't know if it's a resistance, but there's distance from spirituality. And so in our trainings for mental health professionals, we have to kind of sometimes tiptoe around some of the spiritual principles that underlie NARM. I don't know how that is in Israel or from your communities that you've been a part of, but how does the interplay of psychology and spirituality relate to the trainings you've been part of?
First of all, I really love how NARM is combined between, it doesn't always say specifically, but it's really combined between psychology and spirituality. In the trainings I had, some of them had more the spiritual side, and some less. The spiritual stuff I took by myself, like from my own spiritual seeking and from the meditation centers I was, and I combined that with the therapy I do.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like Palestinians are more open if you come from a more spiritual approach versus psychological, or does that make a difference at all?
Some are more open to the spiritual, and some are open to the psychological. So there's no a general rule. And for me, what works best is when you combine them, because some people go just for the spiritual. They have, we call it the spiritual bypass, and they don't really touch the root cause of the stuff. And some only go to the psychology side, and that also gets somewhere stuck. So the combination is very powerful.
Yeah. And then there's another piece that you added in one of your four, and that NARM is very grounded in, which is the embodiment, somatic element.
Exactly.
From my personal perspective, and I think this is aligned with NARM, there's no separation between those three. I mean, embodiment, psychological health, and spiritual openness are all the same process.
And now we are going on a higher spiritual.
Yeah, well, I think both you and I enjoy that.
Yeah, we are really enjoying that.
Yeah. And it is something that I feel like is pretty unique to NARM. I mean, I'm sure there's other models out there that integrate it in similar ways, but there's something about, Larry talks about the psychobiological unity that we see these things all happening simultaneously. So if someone's having a physiological symptom, there's also some kind of psychological process. And there's also some kind of spiritual obstacle or spiritual reaction that's happening as well. And you're right, we don't talk about it usually very directly in the work, the trainings we do, or even the clinical work we do, but it forms the underpinnings of how, you talked about the first part of your 4-step process is really about quieting the mind. And that's a big part of the NARM approach too, is that the therapist has to be in a more receptive state. And when we're actively thinking or trying to figure out what's going on with my client, we're in a more sympathetic, active state. And that's not, by definition, a quiet mind. It's a busy, active mind. It's not that that's bad, because we need that active mind in certain scenarios. But when we're supporting this healing process, this personal growth process, it's so important for the therapist to really be in a quieter place.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that work that we do, we talk a lot in our trainings, and we're training, helping professionals all around the world now, is really, it's a top-down process. It's kind of working with our beliefs. It's also a bottom-up process, working with our somatic or physical reactions. And there's some spiritual element to it as well that we bump up against when we start doing our own work.
I'm curious what kind of things you bump up, like spiritual, for you.
Well, it's funny because as you've been talking, I have a pretty similar background to you. Like, I've spent some time in different meditation centers, and, I was in India and Asia for a while and spent some time in studying meditation, but I never really was aligned to any one particular approach. And I know Larry also for many, many years has done his own study without being aligned to any one particular approach. But I saw very early in my own spiritual work that I was a really bypasser. I was really seeking the spiritual to bypass the deeper emotional pain that I was trying to avoid. And in the NARM language, we talk about the connection survival style. And I had very strong elements when I was younger of having those patterns. And so I was looking for either more intellectualizing concepts that would help me to not feel all my distress, or spiritualizing. And so I still bump up against those patterns in my work as I continue to do my work. So there is a spiritual element to that, because it limits me to really be more, embodied in whatever direction I'm going. So if I'm having thoughts, be embodied in my thinking. If I'm connecting to something larger than myself, let's just call it spiritual, then I'm also firmly planted in my body. And then particularly being in the heart and being in my emotions, that's another way that people can bypass, really being connected. And I feel like once you start working on the levels of the heart, you are working in spirituality.
Exactly.
I'm a big fan of like Rumi's work and stuff. And, I just find that kind of teaching very aligned again with what we do in NARM. Like, on the outside, it's a model for healing complex trauma. But as you said, it's like once we start resolving some of these patterns of who we took ourselves to be, which was formed by trauma, it opens us up to connect to ourselves in much larger and deeper ways than we ever might have imagined.
Exactly. That's coming back to our natural self.
It's also coming back, for me, and this is where our conversation for me is really interesting too, is just, you talked about the trust issues that are part of the Israel, Palestine issue. And, being Jewish and having this background, this is also, I mean, I live in the United States, so it's a different way of orienting to the society, of course, than Israelis or Palestinians. But those trust issues also get in my way of my own personal and spiritual growth. And the vulnerability that you mentioned that you see, from a Jewish perspective, it's pretty threatening and terrifying to be vulnerable when you've been a targeted minority for 3,000 plus years. And it's just, that's the intergenerational trauma that's just like so embedded in our culture. For me, that's where my personal work is really, I'm at right now, is just really understanding the identifications that I've unconsciously taken on from my culture and from historical and intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
How does that land for you, like in terms of your background?
Well, Recently, I discovered how the intergenerational trauma really is affecting me. Like, I give you a small example. My grandfather, during 1948 here, when he had to flee Palestine to go to Lebanon, because a lot of Palestinians needed to flee the area and go to Lebanon. So he had to flee in a dangerous situation. For him, time was like a matter of death and life. He was like very stressed with time. And all my life, I was feeling stressed with time. Like, I can't lose time. If I lose time, I have to use the time very well. I can't lose time. And just in the last like 2 years, I discovered how the stress of time actually doesn't belong to me. It belongs to my grandfather, who lived this period of like time for him was either life or death. And it's affecting me today. And once I did work with it, and I could like manage to stay for 1 hour doing nothing. It started with 5 minutes. I started with 5 minutes. It was very hard for me. And then I spread that 5 minutes to 10 minutes and then to 50 minutes. And then today I can sit for 1, 2 hours and do nothing and just be okay with it. As in the past, if I would sit for 1 minute, it would be so this is the way we can work with stuff that are passed on to us from past generations.
Yeah. I'm curious, I don't know if your father or your grandfather is still alive.
My grandfather, no, but my father, yeah, is still alive.
Okay. I'm curious, as you've done this work over the last couple of years, do you notice any impacts on your father from your own personal work?
On my father, I didn't notice that much, but I noticed on my mother. I noticed on my mother how like she really like like you can say jump 2 steps in her awareness process without doing any processes, without going to any workshop, to any training, to anything. Just it shifted like.
So just by being in the field of the work that you're doing, yeah. And your mother's Polish.
Exactly.
And I mean, I don't know if she's conscious of it, but from your perspective, does she also have a trauma history?
She doesn't see it that way. For her, it's not like people are not aware of if they have any trauma history.
And how about your father? Would he recognize the trauma?
He knows what happened, yeah. He was told what happened, like with his father, with his grandfather. He was told what happened. But I don't know how much he knows, like it's affecting him today. I tell him a lot about it. He says, okay, he doesn't say no, he doesn't say yes. Like he doesn't approve, he doesn't disapprove, but
are there people that you've encountered that do disapprove, that are like, stop poking at this?
In the past, yeah, when I was like telling this stuff, not to the people that were not ready to hear this, because not everyone are ready to hear such things, and when you say it to someone who's not ready to hear it, they will just block it. So in the past more, but today I'm like more aware, like to who is ready to hear that and who is not ready to hear that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so the people that you're engaging with are generally more open to hearing it.
Yeah.
And even still, probably some of them struggle because, as we see in NARM, people want growth, they want connection, they want healing, but they also are invested in these old strategies that block them from what they most want for themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this kind of brings us full circle until, like, I know that you just started the NARM training, but just from being together already and learning some of these core NARM principles, what are you taking that's supportive of the work that you're doing?
It's just approving the work I'm doing, like working with curiosity, taking the skills and the steps and doing the dance inside the therapy sessions or inside the workshop, working in the here and now. The patterns that the client has will show up in the here and now. So this is just approving what I was already doing, and I love that.
Yeah. I don't know if you had any examples of either side of this, like where you've been bringing some of this work with developmental trauma or NARM that's been kind of difficult, that you've struggled with clients, or other sides where you've seen it really kind of expand in any moments of inspiration. I don't know if you could speak to either of those sides.
I can share one inspirational, like a patient of mine, which her father was hitting her when she was a child. And she took the belief about herself that she's bad. She could, how this works. Like the child can't see that what her father is doing is bad. She takes the belief about herself that is bad. And this led to all kinds of destructional patterns, like self-destructional patterns, even like suicide trials. And just in the last sessions, we came to the point that it was okay for her to feel anger towards her parents without the fear of losing them. That it's okay to express anger without the fear of losing the relationship. And this was very transformative for her. You could see like her empowerment coming back, her aliveness coming back. And so this is really inspirational. Like once you see how it really works, it feels we are doing really, really the deep work.
Yeah, like watching someone come alive again.
Yeah.
What a gift to support that for her.
Yeah.
Well, as we're starting to kind of get ready to wrap up, I'm curious about, as we move forward, whether it's your community or just the world, like what are some of the things that you've taken in terms of your learning about developmental trauma, complex trauma, NARM, that just feel really valuable for us to kind of take out into the world more?
One very important thing is that the answers we think we have about specific symptoms we have are usually not the right answers.
Mm-hmm.
Once you do real deep therapeutic work, you discover answers you didn't have an idea that these answers could be, like identifications you have about yourself and stuff like intergenerational, like we spoke. So I recommend everyone to do deep inner therapeutic work, and then things will be revealed, like new answers will be revealed that you had no idea that such answers could exist inside you.
Yeah, that feels inspirational right there. And then for yourself, just like, what's your vision moving forward? Like, where do you see yourself moving in the next few years? What's your passion moving forward?
Well, my passion is spreading this work more and more, coming back to your natural self. At the beginning to the Arabic world, since I'm an Arabic speaker, so I will do it in Arabic, and then in English as well to the whoever is open to receive this.
Mm-hmm. Have you taught out in other Arabic countries outside of Israel?
Not yet. No, not yet.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the different kind of levels of openness, because, I don't know so much about the different Arabic countries in terms of what countries are more open to this kind of work versus the countries that might be more closed to it.
So I'm planning to do it online soon in the Arabic countries, and then I will tell you how it will be.
Yeah. We're going to have a follow-up for sure to revisit this. Well, it's exciting. I mean, I'm happy that, we got to connect, and I'm really looking to build more of these connections cross-culturally, and specifically just with, Arabs and Jews. I think for me, this is really where my passion is, and learning about each other, staying open and connecting through our hearts with each other, because we're all related here, and we're all going to either make this world work and be a better place, or we're going to continue creating what we've been creating. And that's just going to perpetuate a cycle of trauma. So I'm excited that you and I get this chance to connect, and look forward to our continued conversations for sure.
I'm really very excited about that. I feel now it was a conversation from real heart connection.
Yeah. I appreciate all the work you're doing. And I really look forward to us revisiting this in a year or two to see how the work is kind of unfolding for you and bringing this to Arabic countries. And maybe there's a way you and I can work in Israel to do some work together. So I just look forward to that.
Me too. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. You can connect with us in many ways. On Instagram, find us under @the NARM Training Institute, on Twitter @NARM Training, and Facebook @NARM Training as well. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website, www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.